Hey guys, Firebat here, and I'm bringing you the fifth segment of the Whispers of the Old God card review. If you haven't seen the previous segments, check out the thumbnails to my left. If you want to see a specific card, click it below. Anyways, I'm going to hop right into it here with the first card. So first off, we have Scaled Nightmare. This card is a 6 mana 2/8 with at the start of your turn, double this minion's attack. So some potential here for some shenanigans, but overall, not the most exciting card in the world. It is, though, a dragon deck, so with Shredder going away and some of the other high stat minions, Minibot, Muster, those sort of things kind of phasing out and the metagame slowing down a little bit, dragon decks are going to be the new on-curve powerful thing, in my opinion. So I think it's probably better than Dragonoid Crusher and might see some play in just some random dragon decks as a 6-drop. I think it's pretty slow on the field. It's a 2/8 when you play it, so if you don't have board control, it's just going to die for free and accomplish nothing, which makes it pretty weak. And then the final thing about this card is it's got the dream for potential of like you play it and then you cold blood it, so it becomes a 6/8, and then you conceal it, and then when it unstealths, it now has 12 attack because it doubles, and maybe you can make something happen with that, but then you have to be running cold bloods, you have to be running conceals, and it's kind of a big dream to make happen, but maybe someone's going to do it. There's going to be highlights of this card killing people from like a million health, so there's some potential there. So maybe Master of Disguise synergy can get really ridiculous, but Blizzard has been talks about potentially nerfing Master of Disguise because it limits design space for cards like this. So if Master of Disguise gets nerfed, then that dream gets thrown out the window. So overall, I think the card's okay. I think it's probably going to see some amount of play. I don't think it's going to be a staple card by any means. I think it's just kind of a meh card. Next, we have Steward of Shire. So this is a 3 mana 3/3 that whenever you summon a 1 health minion, give it Divine Shield. This card I think is pretty powerful. I think it's a pretty exciting card. It's got some synergy with things like Stand Against Darkness to be able to make a whole ton of 1/1s with Divine Shields. So you just turn all of your recruits basically into uh, Argent Squires. And it's got some synergy with Aggro Paladin and just every Paladin deck I can think of in general. Like, there's just so many 1 health minions in the game that you can run with this. The downside with it being an aggro paladin would be you don't really want to play it on turn 3 because it's just going to die. So then you got to kind of find some weird later game spot to play it in, kind of like the Hobgoblin problem where you want to play it with all these cheap minions. You want to play it like pretty early, but the problem is your Hobgoblin always die if you play it out too fast. So it's got that sort of issue with it, but I definitely think it's going to find play in maybe some sort of Zooey mid-rangey paladin decks more so than even aggro paladin with just abusive sergeants, leprinomes, all those sort of cards interwoven in there just for board control more or less than for actually rushing your opponent down like traditional aggro paladin. And an interesting thing to note with this card is it does work with Death Rattle because it's whenever you summon a 1 health minion. So if Haunted Creeper were still around, which it's not going to be, you could then pop your tokens from Haunted Creeper. It'll make 2/1/1s, which would then get Divine Shield from this. It works with things like Violet Teacher, cards like Imp Master. So I mean, there's just so many things that this card works with that it's going to find a place in the meta. It's going to find a place to. It's going to find a home eventually, just because it works with so many different things. It can synergize with so many different things. So I think this is a really good card. I think it's going to see a lot of play. Next up, we have Scream Cultists. This is a 6 mana 7/6 with Battlecry. Give your Cthulhu +2/+2 wherever it is. So it's one of the Cthulhu buffer cards. And I've said a lot of good things about most of the Cthulhu buffer cards just because the Cthulhu effects at if your Cthulhu has 10 attack is just so powerful. The problem with this one, though, is this comes down after most of those cards. It's later than the Druid card that makes a 4/10. It's just a little bit too slow, I think, to see an exceptional amount of play, and it has pretty mediocre stats. If it was came down turns earlier, it'd be so much better because then all of those synergies are live a lot faster. Now, I guess you already played those synergized cards because of the Cthulhu deck. You're probably just playing on curve, and now this +2/+2 is a lot less significant because it's not activating the if Cthulhu has 10 attack cards. It's instead just buffing your Cthulhu for your overall win condition, which is great. It's just not as good as activating those cards. So I think it's like a pretty okay card. I'm not super thrilled about it. I think it's probably going to see play in Cthulhu decks, obviously, because it's a Cthulhu buff card, but it's not one of the better Cthulhu buff cards by any mean, and I think it might be a little bit too slow to see that much play. Maybe like a one of in Cthulhu decks. Next up, we have Kabalists Tome, which is a pretty interesting card. I had to think a lot about this one. It's a 5 mana card that adds 3 random mage spells to your hand. So there's a lot of potential there to cause some things happening. And the main card I want to really compare this to is Arcane Intellect, which Arcane Intellect is, of course, the 3 mana spell that draws you 2 cards from your deck. So a random card is oftentimes a lot less valuable than a card that you've actually explicitly put in your deck. So you're spending 2 extra mana to get 1 extra card draw when comparing these 2 cards, and the cards you're getting are completely random spells. And looking at the spells, there's only a few bad ones, like Ice Lance can be pretty bad. Some of the secrets can be pretty bad. Mirror images can be like pretty bad. You don't get to choose what they are, but oftentimes you're going to get probably 1 or 2 good cards and then maybe 1 garbage card. And then how valuable is a random garbage card? I don't think a random garbage card is worth 2 mana. And the upside of potentially getting 3 really good cards, I don't think is worth the 2 mana you're paying for it. And a lot of decks don't really want 3 arcane intellects in them. There's just better alternatives for card draw in the game right now. So I'm not so sure how great this card's going to be. I think it will see play. I think people will definitely experiment with it. I don't think it's going to be staple. And another one of the issues I see with the card that makes it a little bit worse than Arcane Intellect is just the sheer cost of it, right? So with 5 mana, most of the time, you're not going to have very much mana to do anything else with your turn. Whereas with Arcane Intellect in decks like Freeze Mage and even Temple Mage to some extent, you can play Arcane Intellect and then interact with the board somehow. You can Frost Nova, you can still Blizzard in Freeze Mage, or with Temple Mage, you can play Flame Waker, then you can Arcane Intellect, then do things. Whereas with Kabalists Tome, you can't go Flame Waker, Kabalists Tome, and then a bunch of spells. You have to go Flame Waker, Kabalists Tome, pass. So it doesn't allow you to do as much flexible things with your card draw mechanic, which Tempo Mage and Freeze Mage both really, really desire, and this card just kind of shuts that off. So maybe some sort of different value mage deck this is going to see a lot of play in. If you like Fatigue Mage starts becoming a thing again, which had like Death Lords and slowed down the game and took their opponent to fatigue, this is going to generate cards instead of drawing cards. So it really fits very well in the Fatigue Mage archetypes, but not so much in the Tempo Mage or the Freeze Mage archetypes. So if that deck starts becoming a thing, this card's going to be exceptional in that. But if that deck never really becomes a thing, there isn't enough things to make the sort of Fatigue Mage kind of happen, then the card will probably fizzle out by the wayside. Next up, we have Sarge, Rage Unbound. So this is the 3rd old god that we've seen released. It's a 10 mana 10/10. At the end of your turn, put a minion from your deck into the battlefield. So again, as with all of the 10 costing legendaries, it's a huge investment, and this one doesn't have very much interaction on the board. Unless you're pulling a taunt, you're probably going to be eating a bunch of damage. It is a 10/10 though, so I mean that's a giant stat pool to get BGH or polymorphed, but yeah, I mean it'll be good if the meta's really, really slow. Maybe you can fit this in like some ancestral ramp druid or something, because we've seen that sort of getting popular with Tice playing it and other pro players. So Astral Communion druid will maybe find a place for this. Not so sure about the card though. I mean, I think it's a lot of investment just taking up your whole turn to have an effect that potentially isn't great. Like even if you design your whole deck around this card being the main thing, well, then you're going to get face hunted. So I'm not so sure about this card. I think maybe like obviously all the old gods, it's really hard to predict what they're going to do. Someone's going to have to build an entire deck around them. It's going to create a new deck archetype. It's probably going to use a lot of the other old gods cards to support it. So it's really hard to say that this card's not going to see play, but at the same time it's really hard to picture this card seeing play, right? So I think it's a card that if the meta's slow enough could be good, but as we've seen in Hearthstone lately, the meta's not usually very slow. So it's going to be hard pressed to see this card see too much play unless there's a dramatic shift in what the meta is currently like. Next up, we have Ancient Harbinger. So this is a 6 mana 4/6. At the start of your turn, put a 10 cost minion from your deck into your hand. Well, the stat line is obviously terrible, a 6 mana 4/6. But the upside to the terrible stat line is if you're playing a Cthulhu deck, if you're playing any of the old gods decks, and it's totally designed around getting that card in play, and then that card wins you the game, this card's going to give you the card that wins you the game. So it'll just improve the consistency dramatically of Cthulhu decks or any of the other old god decks. So there's a lot of potential here for this to be a very useful tool in deck building. If those decks start becoming a thing, it could be a very powerful card. If those decks aren't very good and the 10 drops are just not, the meta's too fast to play Cthulhu or too fast to play Rage Unbound, then it's going to be pretty tricky for this card to see too much play. But if the meta is slow enough for those old gods to see play, I can see this card being alright. I can see it being pretty good. So next up we have Things from Below. So this is a 6 mana 5/5 with Taunt that costs 1 less for each totem you've summoned this game. So I don't know about this card. It's kind of slow, but at the same time, it hits that potential where it's just really, really, really easy to cast pretty quick, and it's going to give you a big tempo swing. And I mean, if you just play one totem throughout the game, it's now a 5 mana 5/5 with Taunt, which is extremely powerful. So I think the card would see some play in Constructed. I mean, it's a defensive mechanism that Shaman kind of needed. They focus a lot around trying to use their hero power, but their hero power sucks. So that's the downside. If there could be like some more ways to incentivize Shaman hero powering more instead of just every time, like when I play Shaman and I hero power a lot, usually I die. So it's tempting really to play this card, but it's really going to depend on how fast or how slow the metagame is if it's going to see play or not. It just might fall flat or it might be incredible. Those are like the only two options for this card really. It just depends is if it sees play, then it's going to be amazing. If it can't see play, then it's going to be, well, it's not going to see play. It's going to be terrible. Anyway, next card we got Master of Evolution. Now this is a 4 mana 4/5 with the battle cry, transform a friendly minion into a random one that costs 1 more. So that's a pretty sweet effect. Like, really sweet, yeah. And it's a 4 mana 4/5, so I mean it's a Yeti at worst case. So the downside is it's a Yeti. The upside is you could potentially turn a very useless minion into something extremely impactful. You could change something that you've used for only the battle cry effect that has a really weak body attached to it. Now it's just a better minion. So it's sort of like the Recombobulator effect. There's no sort of like Recombobulator combos like Priest had with Shadow Madness, then Recombobulator to steal minions. So it has a lot less combo potential than Recombobulator, but the stat line's a lot better than Recombobulator, and it gives you the fact that it costs 1 more. So I think this will probably see play for lack of like really solid 4-drops in Shaman. Like there aren't too many great ones. Maybe you can combo this with Feral Spirits or something after the Overload wears off, but like yeah, it's going to be tricky to figure out where exactly this card fits in, but I think it'll probably see play. It seems like it has a really decent effect. It allows you to just gain mana flat out. So, probably one of the better cards in the set, I think. Next up, we have Ravaging Ghoul. This is a 3 mana 3/3 with Battle Cry, deal 1 damage to all other minions. So, it's a 3/3 that does a Whirlwind effect, which is pretty strong. It has potential with Patron, it has potential with Acolyte of Pain, it has potential with Battle Rage. It allows you to put a Whirlwind effect in your warrior deck and be able to use cards like Battle Rage without having to run Whirlwind, which takes up a card slot and doesn't really influence the board very much. So I think this is a pretty good card. It's a pretty good anti-aggro card. It's a pretty good control card, combo-y card for patrony-esque decks or just mid-range warriors. So, I mean, it's no death bite, but it's a pretty good card. So I'm pretty excited for this card. I think it's gonna help make mid-range warrior a thing. Synergize really well with like literally almost every card in warrior, like frothing and acolyte of pain and patron and battle rage and execute. It's just armor smith. Like there's so many cards that the whirlwind effect synergizes with. It's just so hard to fit whirlwind into a warrior deck because whirlwind by itself is such a weak card and doesn't influence the board enough. Whereas this card's got a 3/3 attached to it, so maybe it'll have enough influence and enough weight that it can actually be justified to play this card. So I'm excited about this card. I think it'll see a lot of play in warriors and new mid-rangey warrior archetypes. All right, next up we have Keeper of the Swamp. This is a 4 mana 3/3 with choose one, summon a 2/2 ooze, or gain an empty mana crystal. And this is a druid only card. This card is pretty good. I mean, you have a really strong effect here with being able to get maybe innervate this out and then be able to continue playing minions after that, so it just neglects the downside of innervate because you're able to then get the wild growth effect and then just continue playing minions on curve and druiding people out, which is really strong. And then let's say you get it later on in the game and you don't need to ramp at all anymore. Not still a 4 mana 5/5, which is pretty good. So I mean, you have a really strong upside of potentially being able to get this out early and ramping into your other plays and dominating the board by just having more mana than your opponent. And then the downside is it's got a weaker body, but does it really? It's still a 4 mana 5/5, which is a pretty good body. So it's got like the potential to just ramp and snowball your opponent out of the game. and the downside is it's a 4-mana 5/5 amongst 2 bodies. So I think this card's really good. I think it's going to see a lot of play. It's just allows you to recover your curve after innervating early on in the game, which is incredibly powerful. And yeah, I mean, it synergizes with the other ramp effects to have really good mid-range druids, really good ramp druids, just more consistency in the early game with druid, which has already been a staple tier 1 deck for since beta. So it's going to be a really good card. I expect to see this card get a lot of play in druid just because it's got a strong upside with very little downside, and that's really what makes cards see a lot of play and what makes cards become staple cards is what is their upside compared to their downside. This card's upside's huge, its downside is pretty much nothing. So it's probably one of the strongest cards, in my opinion, of the whole set so far. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I'm going to be trying to post these every time there's about 10 new cards or so. If you want to see more cool videos, more card reviews, feel free to subscribe to this channel. Follow me on Twitter, follow me on Twitch, all that good stuff. Anyways, that's enough from me, guys. Take care. Bat out. But I really, really like this card. I think it's incredibly strong. I think it is a much better stabilization card than Land Hands because Land Hands draws you 3